a big table. My brother Ernst and I had travelled from Vienna with our father for the 5th Congress of the International Psychoanalytic Association. For the moment, the grimness of the last few contentious months of 1918 gave way to our mood of celebration. Budapest's mayor, István Bácsi, the city magistrates, high-level military and medical officials from Hungary, Austria and Germany welcomed almost 50 of us with receptions and private banquets. Sándor Ferenczi and Melanie Klein were there, and so was the young István Hollos and Géza Horheim, the future anthropologist. Our conversations continued on a Danube steamer, which carried us between our lodgings at the Gellenfurdel Hotel and the meetings at the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. We compared notes on the war neurosis or shell shock and the papers by Ernst Simmel, Ferenczi, Karl Abraham, and Max Eitingon, my father's colleagues who had used psychoanalysis to treat traumatized soldiers with great results. On September 28th, Siegfried Bernfeld and I rode back to the Academy of Science to hear my father speak about the future of psychoanalysis. We were simply not prepared for the force and eloquence of that speech. Freud had titled it Lines of Advance in Psychotherapy, and what he offered was a wholesale commitment to progressive values. But first he warned us that psychoanalysis as a science was in danger, at risk of elitist isolation and medical arrogance. Then he set his sights on the coming years. The conscience of society will awake, he said, and reminded that the poorest man should have just as much right to assistance for his mind as he now has to life-saving help offered by surgery. And that the neuroses menace the health of a people no less than tuberculosis, and can be left as little as the latter to the feeble handling of individuals. It may be a long time before the state comes to see these duties as urgent, he said. Probably these institutions will be started by private charity, sometime or other. However, it must come to this. Ferenczi began planning, but it was Max who opened our first free psychoanalytic clinic 1 year later in Berlin. Meanwhile, I had just gained my certification as a school teacher in Vienna and was in analysis with my father, training to become a psychoanalyst myself. The Budapest speech had set social justice as the goal for all of us. In our practices, at the clinics, in the schools, education is aimed for control and even suppression of the instincts. But at what cost? What if, instead, education aimed to make the individual a useful and civilized member of society? Psychoanalysis could serve as a guide for educators. It could and it would wake the conscience of society. I called on some like-minded colleagues in Vienna to get the project started. My friend August Eichhorn and I met every Friday afternoon, and we toured the social welfare agencies which were thriving under our new social democratic government. Eichhorn was a teacher and a psychoanalyst like myself. We visited Siegfried Bernfeld, who also in 1990 founded Kinderheim Baumgarten, an educational refuge for Jewish child refugees in Vienna. We also visited a former refugee camp in Oberhollabrunn in Lower Austria, which Eichhorn had already transformed into a pioneering state residence and school for troubled adolescents. I was captivated by his work. Eichhorn wasn't only able to reach children otherwise unreachable, He influenced a lot of us. The more Eichhorn and his staff thought about the educational and psychological needs of stigmatized children, the more he pushed for environmental change. Without it, as Danto said, education simply prolongs the status quo and stifles human growth. I joined the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society in 1922, and along with Eichhorn, made the case that the flexibility and innovation of psychoanalysis could be used productively in education. The ideas of Maria Montessori, socialism and psychoanalysis, and even Willem Reis's more radical proposals were popular then. And both Bernfeld and Eichhorn knew how to merge them into the kind of empowering approach to education that would promote systemic change. As my own ideas about education developed, I began to think of the classroom as a modernist place where the child could become a free and self-reliant human being. A conservative teacher of the old school would say, the rebellious spirit of this boy must be broken before it is too late and he has become a serious menace to society. A modern educator, on the contrary, would have the highest hopes for the child's future and would expect to see in him the future and liberator of the masses. We can discover in each child a perfectly definite constellation of hopes and fears, dislikes and preferences, jealousy and tenderness, the need for love and the rejection of it. Children not only need to be taught, but need a chance to teach themselves. At the same time, we impose limitations on their thinking, and we place obstacles in the way of their creative activities. Worse, traditional educators always want to make the child into what suits them, deferring by the century, position, rank and class of the adults. Yet, education appears to us in another light, when we have another aim in view. Disabled children and those affected by war, refugee children, children from poor families, or, as Alfred Adler would agree, those who are simply unloved and misunderstood, call on us to figure out their particular developmental and social needs. Despite all the ordeals and obstacles we faced after the war, our new ideas were welcomed in Vienna in the mid-1920s. Progressive newspapers cheered when Eduard Hitchman opened the ambulatorium, our free outpatient clinic for people of all social classes and occupations. Our wonderful Minister of Education, Otto Glöckl, based his democratic school reforms on a simple idea: education for independence. Within our psychoanalytic society, Josef Friedjung, a pediatrician and city council member, convinced us that both parents and the schools must be involved in preventing childhood neurosis from deteriorating into later adult psychopathology. Friedjung's ideas reminded me of Ferenczi, who advocated for cooperation between educators and pediatricians and psychoanalysts. Analytic education can count amongst its success greater openness between parents and children. And for myself, the positive results of child analysis inspired me to make plans for the first of our modernist, psychoanalytically informed school projects. We called it the Hitzing School. My companion, Dorothy Tiffany Hurling, had the money to build the school, pay the teachers, buy the supplies, and keep the project going for the 5 years, from 1927 through 1932. It was a sweet, 2-level log cabin with enough room for a library and lots of trees in the backyard of Eva Rosenfeld's house in Hitzing. But Dorothy brought in far more than mere wealth. For me, personally, we could share what it meant to be the youngest daughter of a great man. Her father was the American artist, Louis Comfort Tiffany. The progressive worldview she carried from New York matched my modern Viennese outlook. I have spent most of my life trying to understand children, and so had Dorothy. We came up with a pedagogy all our own. To my vision of a school organized according to psychoanalytic principles, we added Montessori's creativity, John Dewey's independent thinking, August Eichhorn's depth of empathy, Siegfried Bernfeld's demand for freedom from repression, and Ferenczi's rejection of what he called traditional cult of authorities. Our search for teachers brought us Erik Erikson and Peter Bloss, two modern-minded young men in their 20s, not yet settled in a career and willing to join an exciting venture of this kind. Bloss later devised our field's theory of adolescent development, while Erikson became famous for his lifespan model of human identity. Ernst Chris took us to the museums in Vienna, but Erik Erikson was an artist. At Hitzing, Erikson said, I began to perceive how important visual configurations were, how they actually preceded words and formulations. Dreams are visual data, and so is children's play. So many teachers judge themselves by what they get children to learn. But teaching is not only presentation of facts, it is persuading students to be interested in life, a state of mind. And they were. Hitzing's values opened my eyes to a wider world, one pupil said. It shows us different ways of thinking. It taught us tolerance and understanding. We met so many different kinds of people. It taught us to see large. Another student said that the school's liberal and creative atmosphere stayed with him all his life. I believe that my own values of anti-racism, individualism, and the absolute need for freedom while rejecting the cult of personality stemmed from the school. Back in Vienna then, we were all so excited, full of energy. It was as if a whole new continent was being explored. We were the explorers, and we now had the chance to change things. Our new psychoanalytic pedagogy came on the scene in a revolutionary spirit. We led seminars, organized the Vienna course for educators, and launched the Zeitschrift für psychoanalytische Pädagogik, the Journal of Psychoanalytic Pedagogy. We started our toddler research at the Jackson Nursery in a space we shared with Maria Montessori's Haus des Kindes on Rudolfsplatz. Of course, we also knew that the right-wing and increasingly militarized parties were gaining power in Vienna. It's enclosed, like many of the city's interwar reformist institutions. But until the end of our lives, even in exile, in all our work with children, Dorothy and I stayed true to Freud's bracing, memorable lines on the conscience of society.
So thank you, Professor Danto. So as Matthew mentioned at the beginning of the talk, if anyone has questions or comments, please use the raise hands feature and I will unmute you. Questions, comments, feedback.
Well, I'll ask the question maybe to get the ball rolling. Yeah, so you mentioned like there's quite a parallel between the red-black Vienna and our current moments of polarization. And I just wondered if, like, doing this research, if you have some lessons for us in terms of how we can think about maybe psychoanalysis in our current polarized times.
That's a great question. What comes to mind is several things. One is start with tone analysis. Through studying Anna Freud and start studying Reich. And I worked on my career sort of took off when I worked at Manhattan Family Court, and with Judge Nanette Dunbar. So it was extraordinary. And he sort of gave me I asked her a question one day and she gave me the answer. That was a long time ago. I think children are much more aware of what's going on than we give them credit for. And I think one can start including children in political discussions, for example. I mean, they may mimic their parents, but maybe not. We don't know. Right? So, and certainly children are aware of environmental tension, and they're aware of anger, whether they know it consciously or not. I mean, one of his many arguments is that children are aware of their own sexuality, and adults repress the awareness, right? But they can't eliminate it. So it's just an idea that I have. It's like bring children on board, and the other is very courageous activism. Like shouting and yelling in the streets. I mean, I remember in the early 1980s episode that just like stayed with me forever. I was at a major university giving a talk, and there we were all in the audience and all very well behaved, and as academics are, and a group from ACT UP came in, and they opened the door and they banged on the door and they clanged the cymbals and they screamed and they yelled and so forth. And finally, they had this letter, and the person running the somewhere or whatever said, okay, I will read your letter if you sit down. And they said, no, read the letter. And you know what? That's kind of stayed with me forever. It's, it's like make noise and stand your ground. And the other, I taught social policy for 25 years at Hunter. And an important part of teaching policy is learning to debate. So we had one group of students who were assigned the role of being conservative. And what was everything from debating everything from tax-funded kindergartens to all sorts of things, right? but, you know, learn to think how the other side thinks if one can, and debate, and also to stand one's ground. Those are some of the, because, you know, Vienna, the Social Democrats were named red by Psycho, the conservative, and they embraced it. They didn't reject it and say, oh no, we're really good people. They embraced it. It's like, yeah, you're black, we're red. You want to call us red, we're red. But anyway, those are just some thoughts.
Elizabeth, did any of this carry over after the Freuds moved or fled to London? Well,
A great deal,
Yeah.
yes, a great deal. With the Hampstead nurseries, the Hampstead Board nurseries. Anna Freud opened one after one venture after the other. There was I mean, in addition to the there were the nursery schools. There was a specific program for children who had been in concentration camps, but then she and the analysts, largely the Viennese analysts, who were exiled, I like to use the term exile, rather than immigration, which drives me a little bit nuts, but collaborated with the juvenile justice system, with all sorts of treatment. Yeah. And that is where also she then started the course for the Hampstead course for child therapy, child analysis and child therapy, which unfortunately closed down last year, but was, you know, had candidates worldwide. It was enormously influential. Yes.
In the debates, the controversial discussions in the British
Yes.
Psychoanalytic Society, was any of this sort of entangled?
Not much, no. Not a lot. That was really, that's really interesting. First of all, Anna Freud throughout those held a very delicate position. She always said, we are guests in England, right? Let's remember a couple of things. You know, they had heavy German, A, they were Jews, yes. B, they had heavy German accents, and the UK had been bombed to smithereens by the Germans. So they had German accents, they were Jewish, they were doing this controversial work, they did not deny sexuality, there were all sorts of things going on. But so Anna Freud, whereas Melanie Klein had been invited by Ernest Jones from Berlin in 1926. So she was in an entirely different social category. And Winnicott himself was British. So she had to be very careful that her work was not labeled, you know, the Jewish or the, and then as we are being, I would just really want to bring this out. Her life partner was Dorothy Tiffany Burlingame. Dorothy was the youngest daughter of Louis Comfort Tiffany, the American artist. And England's position on homosexuality, as we know, was, you know, they could have been thrown in jail. And they were working with kids. So you can just imagine the repercussions if she didn't. So she's fairly deferential during the controversial discussions. Susan Isaacs, some of her other followers, talk about theory a lot more, but she herself is fairly deferential. And she did not talk about politics, but it was the same with the psychoanalysts in the United States. They came here fleeing fascism, boom, what do they find? J. Edgar Hoover. I've written about him too. So I mean, literally, there were analysts who survived fascism in Austria and in Germany, came here and committed suicide because of Hoover. So there are certain, they had to manage their. So that's one, that's many reasons why a lot of this information has been, they didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want to get to the US or to the UK and say, oh yeah, I was a communist in addition to being a Jew. And so.
I think we have a question from Teresa Tisdale.
Yes, thank you. I really appreciate your work and your book and all that you have brought to us about the history of this work of analysts in society. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how in the United States, psychoanalysis as a discipline and psychoanalysts in particular as individuals could work to renew the collaboration and connection between psychoanalysis and education.
Thank you, and thank you for your kind words. Actually, that's an area where I'm really optimistic. The evolution of the website of the American Psychoanalytic has been incredible over the last 15 years. I mean, from really an entirely private practice space to a website that now, they have a prize for the best community clinic, and they take very progressive positions in advocacy. So I've seen enormous change there. And I really do see a lot more political engagement over the last 15 years. So I think there's obviously more work to be done, but I really, compared to other mental health professions and medical professions, I really think that the analysts are moving forward. Yeah, it's an area, it's something I feel good about.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Other questions or comments?
Actually, I have a question about what the structure of the day in one of these nursery schools was like. You gave an example of the chocolate buffet, or the baby buffet, where the teachers just kind of in the background. Was there a structure to the day? Was it just kind of free play?
You mean that this is at the Jackson Nursery?
Yes.
Okay. Because there were many nurseries, I suppose, but the Jackson Nursery, the parents, well, I mean, there's quite a lot on that, but largely the parents brought the kids before breakfast. There is a lot of emphasis on self-care, in addition to self-regulation, self-care, how to learn to eat, how to learn to wash oneself and different little ones and so forth, along with teaching and playing and I think the hours were pretty long, actually. That was in Vienna. The nursery schools in London were wartime nurseries, right? And so those were children of parents. Those were actually residential because these families who went through the Blitz. And that's super interesting. The book that Anna and Dorothy wrote, Parents Without Children, or Children During War, where through their observations, they saw that, you know, all the bombs and the guns and the noises didn't affect the kids at all. What affected them was separation from the parents. So when the parents came or left, and the children, some of the children slept in a bomb shelter in the lower part of the house. Those were the more, those were the things that were more difficult. So they made sure that the parents could come and visit. So there were lots of different faces and lots of different nurseries with lots of different programs. But again, the focus was, you know, from Kindle out, from the child out. And all the tiny ones, even those who, you know, let's just see if they can, you know, if they understand when to stop. I mean, but there are many, many stories like that of children who, you know, stop sucking their thumb, and children who just, you know, so there's sort of, it's really interesting because there's a lot of limit setting, but the limits are where the child is, not where the adult is. So that's really subtle.
Any last questions or comments? If not, we will, I think, wrap up.
So again, I want to make the pitch that the film is free to anybody who wants to use it for training purposes. I'm glad to serve as a consultant. It was developed by the, it was funded by the Austrian government for this conference. Actually, we have the slide of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, which is where Freud spoke and where we had this conference at the Centennial, and it was pretty much the last academic conference. It's been held since then. But yeah, the film is available with German subtitles, Portuguese subtitles, and Italian subtitles. And just ask me for a copy, or I'm happy to do any consultation around it.
Thank you so much. This was great.